In the scorching summer of 1861, along the humid lowlands of central Alabama, a woman named Dinah committed an act so calculated and merciless that it would be whispered about in parlors and churches for generations, always with a mixture of horror and something else, something the white society of the South could never quite name. She buried alive Colonel Marcus Thornhill, his wife Catherine, their 3 children, and the house overseer in a specially prepared pit beneath the old smokehouse of Thornhill Plantation. The bodies were discovered 6 days later, their fingernails broken and bloody from clawing at the earth above them. This is not a story of sudden violence or passionate revenge. This is a story of systematic planning, of a mind pushed beyond the boundaries of sanity by an institution that treated human beings as livestock, and of a reckoning that the South had long pretended would never come. You are watching a chronicle from the darkest chapters of American history, where we unearth the stories that the old families tried to bury as deeply as Dinah buried her oppressors. Thornhill Plantation sprawled across nearly 4,000 acres of prime cotton-growing land in Lowndes County, Alabama, situated between Montgomery and the Black Belt region, where the soil ran dark and rich as coffee grounds. Colonel Marcus Thornhill, age 43 in that fateful summer of 1861, was not born to wealth but had married into it when he took Catherine Beaumont as his bride in 1842. Catherine came from old Charleston money, and her dowry had included 27 enslaved people and the capital to purchase the Alabama property. By 1861, the Thornhill holdings had expanded to include 214 enslaved men, women, and children, making it one of the most prosperous operations in the county. The colonel himself was a man of rigid bearing and careful habits, educated at the College of Charleston, fluent in Latin and Greek, a deacon at First Baptist Church of Hayneville, and a man who prided himself on what he called orderly management of his human property. He kept meticulous records in leather-bound ledgers, recording births, deaths, purchases, and sales with the same attention to detail that he applied to cotton yields and market prices. His wife, Catherine, 38 years old, was known throughout the county as a woman of refinement and strict Christian principles, who taught Sunday school for white children and occasionally instructed the house servants in basic scripture, believing that a Christian slave was a docile slave. The plantation itself was a monument to Southern prosperity and the wealth built on forced labor. The main house stood 3 stories tall, white-columned and imposing, surrounded by magnolias and live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Behind it stretched the quarters, 2 long rows of wooden cabins where the enslaved population lived in cramped, dark spaces that baked in summer and leaked in winter. There were the cotton fields, endless and white during harvest season, the cotton gin house, the barn, the stables, the smokehouse, the kitchen building, and the overseer's cottage. The overseer in 1861 was a man named Silas Gant, 31 years old, originally from Georgia, who had been hired 3 years prior for his reputation as a man who kept good order through fear and the whip. The Thornhill children, Marcus Jr., age 14, Catherine Ann, age 11, and little Robert, age 7, were being raised in the manner of Southern gentry, which meant they were taught from infancy that the people who served them were a separate and inferior species of humanity, created by God to labor for their betters. Into this world of rigid hierarchies and unquestioned brutality, Dinah had been born in 1829 on a rice plantation in South Carolina. She had been purchased by Catherine's father as a girl of 8 and given to Catherine as a personal maid when Catherine was herself only 10 years old. The 2 girls had grown up together in that strange, twisted intimacy that characterized so many relationships between white daughters and enslaved girls in the antebellum South. Dinah had dressed Catherine for her wedding, had traveled with her to Alabama, had attended to her during the births of all 3 children, had sat with her during illnesses, had brushed her hair 10,000 times, had buttoned 10,000 buttons, had known every mood and thought that crossed her mistress's mind. By 1861, Dinah was 32 years old, tall and angular, with eyes that the household had learned to read for storms. She had been married twice according to slave custom, though neither union was recognized by law. Her first husband had been sold away in 1851 when the colonel needed ready cash. Her second had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1858 after working in the rain for 3 consecutive days. She had borne 4 children, 2 had died in infancy. The other 2, a girl named Rose, age 9, and a boy named Benjamin, age 7, lived in the quarters and worked in the fields despite their youth, for the colonel believed that children should begin earning their keep as early as possible. The other key figures in this tragedy must also be named and remembered, for they were not abstractions but human beings with names, faces, hopes, and the capacity for suffering. There was Samuel, age 46, the head driver, a man who had learned to survive by enforcing the master's will with enough vigor to avoid suspicion, but not so much as to earn the eternal hatred of his fellow enslaved. There was Ruth, age 51, the cook, who had been at Thornhill longer than anyone else, and who possessed a kind of grim wisdom about the ways of white folks and the strategies of survival. There was Moses, age 28, who worked in the stables and had twice attempted to run away, bearing the scars of his failed escapes on his back. There was Lily, age 19, who worked in the main house and whom Silas Gant had been visiting in the night, a fact known to everyone on the plantation, but never spoken of aloud. There was old Tom, age 63, too worn down for field work but kept on to do odd jobs because the colonel considered himself too Christian a man to simply turn out an elderly slave to starve. And there was Grace, age 24, who had been purchased just 8 months earlier from a neighboring plantation, and who had not yet learned the specific cruelties and patterns of Thornhill. The trigger for what followed came in early June of 1861, just weeks after the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter had officially begun the war that would tear the nation apart. The colonel, like most men of his class and region, was aflame with Confederate patriotism and had organized a company of local men to march off to Virginia. Before his departure, scheduled for late June, he called together his entire enslaved workforce in the yard behind the main house. It was a scorching afternoon, the air thick and still, and the colonel stood on the back gallery in his new gray uniform, while Silas Gant and 2 other white men from neighboring plantations stood with rifles to either side. The colonel informed the assembled people that he would be leaving to fight for Southern independence, that his wife would be managing the plantation in his absence with Gant's assistance, and that he expected absolute obedience and continued hard work. Then he said something that would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. He announced that any slave who attempted to run away or cause trouble during the war would not merely be whipped, but would see their children sold away immediately, with the proceeds going to the Confederate cause. He looked directly at Dinah when he said this, because Dinah was standing near the front of the crowd, and because he knew she was clever enough to be dangerous. What he did not know, what he could not have known because the habit of command had blinded him, was that Dinah had already passed beyond fear into a colder, darker territory of the soul. That night, Dinah did not sleep. She lay on her thin mattress in the cabin she shared with 5 other women, and listened to the breathing and the snoring and the occasional moan of someone caught in nightmare, and she made her decision. It was not a decision born of sudden rage or impulse. It was calculated, deliberate, the product of a mind that had been storing up every slight, every cruelty, every casual evil for 32 years, and that had finally accepted that there was no redemption possible within the system, no appeal to mercy or justice that would ever be honored. The colonel's threat to sell away children had simply illuminated what Dinah had always known in her bones. These people saw her children, not as human beings, but as tools to control her, as leverage, as livestock to be traded for guns and ammunition. If she did nothing, her children would be slaves their entire lives, and their children after them. If she was going to be damned, she would be damned for something that mattered. Pause for a moment and reflect, until where did the institution of slavery transform human beings into instruments, and at what point did those instruments learn to turn back upon their wielders? In a system that denied every human impulse and dignity, that separated mothers from children and husbands from wives, with the casualness of a man selling a horse, what form could resistance take, except the absolute destruction of the system's avatars. Over the next 2 weeks, Dinah began to prepare. She was careful, methodical, patient. She enlisted no one at first because she knew that the plantation was full of eyes and ears, that some people would betray her out of fear or hope of reward, and that the walls between cabins were thin. But she began to gather materials and information. She learned the colonel's schedule, his wife's habits, the times when the children were in their rooms, the movements of the overseer. She studied the smokehouse, which was an old structure built partially into a hillside, with a dirt floor and thick walls. One night, when she was supposed to be doing mending in the main house, she slipped out and spent 20 minutes examining the smokehouse's foundation and the loose sandy soil beneath it. She realized that it would be possible, with enough time and effort, to dig a chamber beneath the floor large enough to hold several people. The smokehouse was rarely entered in summer because there was no meat to smoke, which meant she could work without being discovered. But she could not do this alone. Finally, on a Sunday evening after the white family had gone to services at Hayneville, and most of the enslaved population was resting, Dinah approached Samuel, Ruth, Moses, and Grace. She chose them carefully. Samuel, because he was the head driver and could move around the plantation without arousing suspicion. Ruth, because she had been there the longest and had the coldest eyes Dinah had ever seen. Moses, because he had tried to run and failed, and she knew he carried that failure like a stone in his chest. Grace, because she was new enough that she had not yet been beaten into complete submission. She told them what she intended to do. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ruth said, simply, "When?" And Dinah knew she had her answer. They dug at night, working in shifts of 2, taking turns keeping watch. The soil beneath the smokehouse was sandy and relatively easy to remove, but it had to be done quietly, and the excavated dirt had to be scattered in places where it would not be noticed. They dug for 12 nights, creating a chamber approximately 10 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. They shored up the walls with planks stolen from a disused shed. They cut a trapdoor in the smokehouse floor and disguised it with dirt and straw. The physical labor was exhausting, done after full days of work in the fields and the house, but none of them complained. There was a kind of grim exhilaration in the work, a sense that they were doing something that the white people had always promised was impossible. When the chamber was finished, Dinah stood at the bottom of it with a lantern and looked up at the square of darkness above and felt something that might have been satisfaction or might have been the complete absence of all human feeling. The plan was set for June 28th, 2 days before the colonel was scheduled to depart for Virginia. That night, there was to be a small celebration, a farewell dinner attended by several neighboring plantation families. But at the last minute, 2 of the invited families sent word that they could not attend, frightened by rumors of slave unrest following John Brown's raid 2 years earlier and the secession crisis. This meant that only the Thornhill family and Silas Gant would be in the main house that evening. Dinah saw the hand of God, or fate, or simple chance in this, and took it as a sign to act. That afternoon, Ruth prepared a special cake for the dinner, working alone in the kitchen building. She mixed into the batter a quantity of laudanum, stolen over several weeks from Mrs. Thornhill's medicine cabinet. The dose was not enough to kill, but enough to make a person deeply drowsy and confused. The cake was served as dessert at 9 o'clock in the evening. By 10 o'clock, the colonel was complaining of exhaustion and retired to his study. Mrs. Thornhill took the children upstairs to their rooms. Silas Gant stumbled back to his cottage. All of them were asleep within the hour, a deep, drugged sleep from which they would not easily wake. At 11 o'clock, Dinah, Samuel, Moses, and Grace entered the main house through the back door, which Ruth had left unlocked. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the soft snoring from upstairs. They moved like ghosts through rooms they knew better than their own cabins, rooms they had cleaned and polished and maintained for years without ever being allowed to sit in the chairs or eat at the tables. They went first to the children's rooms. Marcus Jr. was sprawled across his bed in his nightshirt. Catherine Ann was curled on her side, her doll clutched in one arm. Little Robert was so deeply asleep he barely seemed to breathe. The sight of the children caused Grace to hesitate, her hand going to her mouth. Dinah looked at her and said, very quietly, "They will grow up to be the same as their parents. They are already being taught to see us as animals." Grace's hand fell, and she nodded. They carried the children down first, one by one, wrapped in blankets, so that even in their drugged state, they would not wake from the sudden cold of night air. Then they went back for Mrs. Thornhill, who was heavier and harder to manage, and then for the Colonel, who was dead weight and had to be dragged part of the way. Finally, they went to the overseer's cottage and brought Silas Gant, who murmured and thrashed but did not wake. All six were placed in the chamber beneath the smokehouse, laid out side by side on the dirt floor like dolls arranged by a child. Dinah stood at the edge of the pit and looked down at them. In the lantern light, their faces were peaceful, untroubled, unaware of what was happening or what was to come. For a moment she thought about climbing down and putting a pillow over each face, making it quick, making it merciful. Then she remembered her children in the field at age 7, remembered her first husband's face the day he was sold, remembered the sound of the whip, remembered 1,000 casual cruelties, and she felt nothing at all, except the need to be finished. They replaced the trap door. They shoveled dirt over it until the floor of the smokehouse looked undisturbed. They scattered straw over the dirt. They closed the smokehouse door and walked away. The entire operation had taken less than 3 hours. By 2 in the morning, all of them were back in their cabins, lying in their beds, waiting for dawn and for whatever would come. The next day, Sunday, June 29th, the White family's absence was not immediately noticed because they sometimes slept late on Sundays. But by noon, when they had not appeared for the midday meal, the house servants began to worry. By mid-afternoon, when there was still no sign of the family or the overseer, the driver Samuel organized a search. They looked in the house, in the outbuildings, in the fields. They questioned everyone on the plantation. No one had seen anything unusual. No one knew anything. The neighboring plantations were alerted. The sheriff was summoned from Hayneville. Slave patrols combed the roads and woods, looking for signs of an attack or an escape. Messages were sent to Montgomery. By nightfall, more than 100 white men were involved in the search, all of them assuming that the family had been kidnapped or murdered by abolitionists or runaway slaves, all of them expecting to find bodies in a ditch or a barn. Throughout that day, and the days that followed, Dinah went about her normal duties with perfect calm. She answered questions when asked. She expressed appropriate concern and confusion. She comforted the other enslaved people, some of whom were genuinely frightened about what would happen to them if the White family was not found. She never once looked toward the smokehouse. She never once showed anything in her face that could be read as guilt or knowledge. She had learned, over 32 years of slavery, how to hide everything that mattered behind a mask of servility and compliance, and now she wore that mask with perfect discipline. If you are finding this chronicle illuminating, and wish to continue receiving accounts of the forgotten and buried chapters of American history, I invite you to follow this channel, where we examine the human cost of systems built on oppression and the terrible mathematics of power and resistance that shaped this nation. It was old Tom who found them. On the 6th day of the search, he happened to go into the smokehouse to check on some tools he had stored there. He noticed that the dirt floor looked disturbed, as if something had been buried. He began to dig with his hands, thinking perhaps someone had hidden stolen goods. His fingers touched fabric. He dug more frantically. He uncovered an arm. He ran from the smokehouse, screaming, and within an hour the chamber had been opened, and the bodies brought up into the afternoon sunlight. They were all dead, of course. They had died of suffocation, of thirst, of terror, of the slow realization of their situation. The children's fingernails were torn and bloody. The colonel's face was frozen in an expression of absolute horror. Mrs. Thornhill's hands were locked around her youngest son's body, as if she had been trying to protect him even in death. Silas Gant had clawed at the wooden planks above, until his fingers were nothing but exposed bone and shredded flesh. The white population of Lowndes County went insane with rage and fear. This was not supposed to happen. Slaves were supposed to be passive, docile, grateful for their care. The presence of evil in their midst, evil that had worn a familiar face, and served them breakfast and brushed their hair, was more terrifying than any abolitionist raid or slave rebellion. It meant that none of them were safe, that the people they thought they owned were capable of meticulous planning and merciless execution. It meant that the entire foundation of their world was a lie. Every enslaved person on Thornhill Plantation was arrested and interrogated. The methods used were brutal even by the standards of a brutal time. Men and women were whipped until they could no longer stand. They were burned. They were subjected to water torture. Children were threatened. Some confessed to crimes they had not committed simply to make the pain stop. But Dinah said nothing. She was beaten until her back was hamburger meat, until her face was swollen beyond recognition, until she could not walk. She was locked in a corn crib without food or water for 3 days. She was shown instruments of torture and promised slow death. She never broke. She never said a word except to maintain her innocence and to say that she knew nothing about what had happened to the family. In the society where even love was property, where human beings could be sold like furniture and families destroyed with the stroke of a pen, madness seemed not an aberration, but an inevitable destination for those with the clarity to truly see their situation. Ruth broke first. After her fingers were crushed one by one in a vise, she gave up Dinah, Samuel, Moses, and Grace. They were all arrested and taken to the county jail in Hayneville, where they were held in chains while a trial was prepared. The trial, if it could be called such, lasted less than 4 hours. There was no question of innocence or guilt. The question was only what form the execution would take. The judge, a man named Cornelius Blake, who had been a friend of Colonel Thornhill, sentenced all 4 to be hanged in the public square on July 15th. The sentence was to be carried out at dawn, so that the maximum number of people, both white and enslaved, could attend as a lesson in the consequences of resistance. The night before the execution, Dinah was visited in her cell by Reverend Amos Pritchard, the Baptist minister who had presided over the Thornhill family's religious instruction. He came to pray with her, to urge her to confession and repentance, so that her soul might be saved, even as her body was destroyed. Dinah listened to him in silence for some time, and then she spoke. What she said was recorded by the Reverend in a letter to a colleague, a letter that survived in a private collection and was discovered in the 1950s by a historian researching slave resistance. She said, "Reverend, you ask me to repent. Repent of what? Of being born, of watching my children grow up as slaves, of knowing that my daughter will be used the same way I was used, that my son will be worked to death in a field he can never own. You have preached to me about Christian submission and turning the other cheek, and the rewards of heaven, but I have seen no rewards and no heaven, only the whip and the auction block, and the endless grinding machine that takes people and turns them into commodities. I am not sorry for what I did. I am only sorry that I could not do more. I am only sorry that there are thousands more like the Thornhills, and that my death will change nothing. But at least those 6 will never own another human being. At least those 6 will never sell another child. At least I showed them that we are not animals. We can plan, we can act, we can make them afraid. And maybe someday, that fear will grow into something that breaks this whole rotten system apart." The Reverend left the cell without saying another word. He never spoke publicly about what Dinah had said,
but his letter reveals that he was deeply shaken, that he began for the first time to question the moral foundations of the society he had spent his life defending. It was not enough to change his actions, but it was enough to haunt him for the rest of his days. At dawn on July 15, 1861, Dinah, Samuel, Moses, and Grace were taken from the jail and marched to the scaffold that had been erected in the center of Hayneville's public square. Several thousand people had gathered to watch, including most of the white population of the county and hundreds of enslaved people who had been forced to attend by their owners. The 4 condemned prisoners were made to stand on the scaffold, while a magistrate read out their crimes and their sentences. Then the nooses were placed around their necks. It was said that Dinah did not tremble or weep. She stood straight and tall, and her eyes swept over the crowd with what witnesses described as a look of absolute contempt. When the trapdoor opened and she dropped, her neck did not break cleanly, and she strangled slowly for nearly 15 minutes before she died. Samuel and Moses died quickly. Grace, the youngest, thrashed and struggled for even longer than Dinah, and some people in the crowd turned away or covered their ears to block out the sounds she made. The bodies were left hanging until nightfall as a warning. Then they were cut down and buried in unmarked graves in a corner of the county cemetery, reserved for criminals and paupers. Dinah's children, Rose and Benjamin, were sold at auction 3 days later. Rose was purchased by a plantation owner in Mississippi and died of yellow fever in 1863, age 11. Benjamin was bought by a speculator and resold to a plantation in Louisiana, where he was worked in the cane fields until his death in 1870, age 16, never having known freedom. The other enslaved people of Thornhill Plantation were dispersed in various sales over the following months, as the property had to be liquidated since there were no surviving Thornhill heirs. The plantation itself was eventually purchased by a consortium of investors and continued to operate until Sherman's march in 1865 brought destruction to the region. Ruth, who had broken under torture and revealed the conspiracy, was not executed because she had cooperated with the authorities. Instead, she was sold to a plantation in Georgia. She died there in 1864, age 54, under circumstances that were never recorded. Old Tom, who had discovered the bodies, was given his freedom as a reward, but freedom in 1861, Alabama meant only that he was no longer any white person's property, while still being subject to every law and custom designed to keep black people subordinate and vulnerable. He died in 1862 of starvation, a free man with no means to survive. Lily, the girl whom Silas Gant had been assaulting, gave birth to his child 6 months after his death. The baby was sold away from her when it was 2 years old, because a mixed-race child was considered evidence of disorder on a plantation. The tragedy of Thornhill Plantation was not simply the deaths of the Thornhill family, horrible as those deaths were. The tragedy was the entire system that made such an event possible, even inevitable. The tragedy was that a woman could be so brutalized by her existence that burying alive the people who enslaved her seemed like the only act of agency available to her. The tragedy was that children were raised as property and died as property. The tragedy was that human beings were treated as commodities, and that an entire society built its wealth and culture on that fundamental evil. The tragedy was that this happened not in some distant barbaric civilization, but in America, in the 19th century, under the rule of law, and in the name of Christian civilization. When we look back at the story of Dinah and the Thornhills, we are looking at the moral abyss at the heart of American slavery. We are looking at what happens when one group of people claims absolute power over another, when human beings are redefined as property, when the normal bonds of sympathy and recognition are severed by ideology and economic interest. We are looking at a system so comprehensively evil that it corrupted everyone it touched, masters and slaves alike, warping human relationships into instruments of control and resistance, turning everyday life into a battlefield where the most intimate interactions were shadowed by the threat of violence. The lesson, if there is one, is not that enslaved people were capable of violence. Of course they were. Human beings under extreme oppression are capable of extreme acts. The lesson is that slavery itself was the original violence, the founding crime, the sin that stained the nation's soul, and from which so many subsequent evils flowed. Every act of resistance by enslaved people, from the smallest work slowdown to Dinah's calculated massacre, was a response to that original violence, an assertion of humanity against a system designed to deny it. The white South wanted to see itself as civilized, as Christian, as the defender of a noble way of life. The reality was that it had built its civilization on the systematic brutalization of millions of human beings, and that brutalization produced brutality in return. These stories reveal the price of power and the silences that the South preferred to forget. They show us that history is not a simple narrative of progress and improvement, but a tangled, blood-soaked chronicle of human cruelty and human resistance. They remind us that the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about the past, about benevolent masters and happy slaves, about the Old South as a place of grace and gentility, are lies designed to hide the terrible truth of what was done and what was suffered. And they challenge us to remember, to bear witness, to refuse the easy comfort of forgetting, in favor of the harder work of reckoning with our history in all its horror and complexity. Until we truly face what slavery was and what it did to this nation, we will never fully understand the world we inherited or the work that still remains to be done to repair what was broken.